All right, recording has started, and this is the January 26th, 2023 Crossplane community meeting, one day before my birthday. So happy birthday to me, and let's jump on into it. So milestone checkup, reviewed 1.11 is the big thing on everyone's mind right now, but we also did do a patch release just recently for 1.10.2 that fixed I think a problem that had a lot of impact. So let's actually, let me do something real quick with the chat. I'm going to drop into the chat a direct link to the agenda doc if folks don't already have that. And that will take you into the agenda doc, and then you can add as suggestions any topics that you want to talk about. All right, let's hop into the release. That Dan drove this release and the fix as well. So Dan, give us an update on this one if you can.
Sure. So this was a fix that was very similar to the one that went into 10.1 as well. So for context, kind of like setting the background for this, in v1.10.0, some folks like Bulat and Nick and some other folks worked on making the establishment of resources in a package concurrent, right? So we spin off some Go routines, right, and establish those instead of doing it serially, which is awesome. One of the things that did, though, is it changed the ordering of references. So if you take a provider revision or configuration revision, it has references to all of the resources that it owns in its status. And then on the resources, the active revision has a controller reference and the inactive has an owner reference. So that's great. But doing the concurrent establishment changed the ordering of the collection of those resource references, right? Because it was non-deterministic. And it was non-deterministic between reconciles, whereas before it was reflective of the order they were included in the package. So anyway, the references were basically jumping around in the status. And so when we updated the status of the revision, it would trigger the parent controller, which is for the provider configuration, which would then trigger the revision controller. Basically every 10 seconds or so, you'd have like a reconcile loop, which is pretty expensive, right? Because these reconcilers are actually establishing, potentially like 1,000 CRDs or something like that. So not a great situation. In v1.10.1, we fixed it. But on the inactive revisions, because of the way it's doing establishment, it's basically just putting its owner reference on there. It doesn't have the UID of the resource of the CRD or composition or XRD. And so those references, we were using the UID as the sort key to ensure we had deterministic ordering, but that was not present on the inactive ones. So the inactive ones were doing what we noticed on the active ones before. So anyway, we moved to using GVK instead as the actually GVK plus name, which is important because of how some things are types and some things are instances, to do that reference ordering, which also has a nice property of just like having what you'd expect in the order there. So anyway, it got us out of that jumping around and changing of the status. You'll still have a pretty big spike there, right, when you first install a package. And that's really nice in some respects because you can get the availability of those types faster, right? You install provider AWS and you have all the AWS types. But there's a follow-up issue that will not go into this next release, but something we want to explore with the community around making that tunable, right? So you can say, hey, actually, I don't want you to slam my API server. Let's smooth that out a little bit over time. So we'll keep exploring that along with all of the conversations about, resource usage and that sort of thing.
Awesome, Dan, and it's great to get that confirmation from folks that were specifically affected by this issue as well, and be able to provide that graph here as well. So thank you very much to Dan for following up and confirming this fix there too. And, to my naive eyes, this line is a lot lower than this line. So it looks like a good fix to me. All right, so that was 1.10.2. That release that went out last week, so since the last community meeting. And let's go ahead and get into the big 1.11 release that's going on. So currently we are in code freeze now. So we are finalizing a lot of things for the release and doing a lot of testing right now, basically is where we're at. We have a specific ask for testing later on that we'll get into in more details within the agenda. But let's take a quickie look here at the release board to see where things are winding down. So I think maybe, so these are things we identified as things that we want to continue spending time on in the 1.11 timeframe, not necessarily explicitly blocking the release, but things that we want to continue spending time on. The one that I think is making the most, that's underneath or under the most scrutiny and effort right now is this last bump to all of the dependencies for core Crossplane. Nick went through a lot of effort to get the Kubernetes client dependencies and packages dependencies updated in Crossplane runtime. And so updating those dependencies as well in core Crossplane is something that would be ideal for getting done before the 1.11 release goes out the door. Hassan has been making a lot of progress on some exponential backoff scenario investigations. There's not going to be a fix for that in 1.11, but there are some proposals for how to approach that. And we'll talk about the controller config deprecation as well in just a little bit. So we don't have to get into that now. So then the other one I wanted to bring up is that the RBAC permissions issue in OpenShift. Nick reviewed this fairly thoroughly, and I don't think there's been, where's the PR? I think it should be linked up from the top right here. There we go. So I don't think there's been yet a response from the PR author from Nick's feedback from a few days ago. So it looks like this one would probably not be included in 1.11 as well. This may be something we can consider for a patch release, but there are some changes that are needed on this PR. So that's the things that are on my radar for 1.11 as we're winding things down. 3659 is going to be the probably the biggest remaining thing to handle. What else is on people's minds for the release as we're going towards Tuesday when the release is being is planned to go out?
I want to show some of we're doing a big reorg. We're finally pushing a big reorg and some new design stuff for the docs. So if folks don't have questions on features or issues.
Yeah, Pete, I have the big docs design, redesign, reorg stuff as a specific topic later on as well.
Then I will
if
wait.
You want to save it till then? Okay.
Yeah.
Sweet. Sounds good, bud. All right, so then the release calendar, the community calendar was updated as well with, we did push the 1.11 release back 2 weeks. And so we're going to stay or remain on our quarterly cadence. So every 3 months, releases will go out. So in about 3 months, the 4th Tuesday, I think it is, of April will be the 1.12 release. So the community calendar is up to date now with all of that stuff. Okay, so that's 1.11. And then next community meeting, once we've got 1.11 out the door, then we can have a nice big planning discussion, I think, together as we're getting 1.12 kicked off and kind of make sure that we all have we're aligned on priorities and we're getting folks that can contribute to things assigned to issues that we want to continue making progress on. So we can talk about that in the next community meeting, I think, and focus on getting 1.11 shipped right now. But if there is a pressing topic that folks want to bring up that'll be after 1.11, the floor is open for that right now too, if somebody wants to get into a specific topic. All right, then let's move on to the providers. So there's definitely been some cool releases coming out recently. And so Christopher Har, I see that you're on the call and you've got the first two, I think they're both new providers, right? An OpenSearch and a Zscaler one. So you want to talk about those?
Yeah, in general, from my company, we open source the provider for OpenSearch in our DKB Bank Git organization. Thanks to Daniel or Dan to drive the marketplace things to onboard. And the same for the Zscaler thing. We're working with our partners from the bank side with Zscaler together, that we bring this also in the Zscaler organization, that we get also professional support on these providers, and it's also public available for other folks in the community. It's open source, so yeah. And every or both providers are generated out of the Upjet approach from the provider perspective. So thanks for Upbound to open source that we can use this.
Awesome, dude. Yeah, I thought that was really cool to see two brand new providers when I was going through recent releases. So excellent work at driving all of those, Chris, and then Dan as well for helping out, get those published and everything. And then also, Christopher, I think there was for the community AWS provider, there was a 36.0 and a 36.1 release, perhaps. Is that correct, since the last community meeting?
Yeah, that's correct. So in general, one release we tried to fixing the Kafka service in AWS side, and we found out that there's a problem in the observe state. That's why we also published a patch release. Because it was not possible to observe an existing Kafka cluster. So hopefully it's working now.
Awesome, great. Yeah, so thanks for getting that patch then out for in response to folks.
I guess in the normal release, the biggest thing was that we also changed the logger to ISO 8601 time encoder, because a lot of folks had problems in their logging solutions to ingest all the logging times and so on. So, and we did it like, I guess in provider Kubernetes and Helm, that we get the same timestamps in the loggings, and not something like Go is doing or the Zap is doing per default.
Oh, interesting. I have a vague memory of Nick opening a similar issue, perhaps, maybe in Crossplane runtime recently, about the timestamp encoding for debug logging. So maybe this was related to that, I think.
Yeah, it is very difficult otherwise to find corresponding logs between a lot of things in the Kubernetes world if you're not using the correct time encoder. So we had some troubles in the past. That's why we also adding this to the provider AWS to find out things between all of the things we're running in Kubernetes.
Just as a heads up, I think that will actually be fixed in the latest. It's fixed in the latest controller runtime. So I bumped Crossplane runtime to use that. So if you update those, you'll get this fixed automatically. I actually can't remember if my recollection was that back in the day, let's say a year plus ago, it used epoch timestamp when you read info mode, which is supposed to be like machine readable. It's all structured JSON data. But then it definitely used RFC 339 on debug mode, where it's supposed to be read by humans. So I think it's going to use 3339 all the time now, is my understanding.
Yeah, that's correct.
Cool. Awesome, Nick. And then Nick, were you present when we were talking earlier about the V1.11 release board and the remaining potential work on bumping the Kubernetes dependencies and the Crossplane runtime dependencies?
Yeah, I was making a coffee, so I was slightly distracted. Yes, I did hear a little bit about that.
Okay, cool. Anything else to add then from my update there?
I'm the risk of potentially repeating you. I think the only blockers on the PR that updates the dependencies are there's one type to do with secret stores that is losing a bit of metadata for reasons that a couple of us have been looking into and we can't quite get to the bottom of. But the other thing is we recently merged a PR that adds a bunch of fuzz testing from the OSS fuzz and CNCF folks to Crossplane. And for some reason, the fuzz tester fails on this PR with a bunch of Crossplane functionality, despite the fact that that functionality didn't change. We only changed dependencies, so I need to figure out what's going on there. I think the fuzz tester is actually set to just like pull the GitHub action it uses from master every time or something, which potentially we just have like a different version of the fuzz test running on this PR or something. Anyway, there's a few little things to work through there that are, annoyingly like taking a long time, basically. maybe relative to the value that they're adding, but we want to try and get through them today.
Awesome, Nick. And yeah, that did not repeat me at all. That I did not have that specificity of what's going on with the effort to update those dependencies. So thank you for adding that. Cool. Okay, and then there is a set of 3 updates there for Upbound's official providers for the big 3 cloud providers. So those are available, and you can click the links to follow those through to the marketplace. And then, I guess there was a provider Terraform release since the last community meeting as well, 0.4.0. So lots of provider activity and new releases to try out and upgrade to that are available now. Yes.
Just quickly on provider Azure and GCP, they actually went through a big update in terms of the underlying Terraform provider that was 6 months out of date. So folks who upgrade that, like we did a lot of testing to make sure that resources still worked. But it was a big gap between the previous version of the Terraform provider and the new ones we updated to. So just keep an eye on the release notes and some small kind of like casing changes in service names and stuff like that.
Yeah, thank you for calling that out, John. That's a really good point. And then, John, do you have a further commentary on like the cadence for updating the underlying Terraform providers, going forward now that we've done this investment and have some tooling around it?
Yeah, so we've built some kind of like some tooling to detect schema changes as well as changes between the Terraform plan state, and we're looking to automate that. With this first round, because it was such a big time frame, we wanted to do some manual testing rather, but we've got kind of like the core tooling in place, and our aim is to kind of like stay up to date with the upstream release of the Terraform providers. We've kind of like moved from weekly releases on the providers to fortnightly releases, just to allow a little bit more time to bake in some changes and make sure that they work well. So I would expect the next one we need to upgrade is AWS, which is a big one as well. And after that, we'll be investing in some tooling to make sure that we automate the process of testing, when we upgrade the native Terraform provider. And that will be at a regular cadence where we're not out of sync so for such a big period.
Right, that's great, John. Thanks for clarifying that. And the investment there so that we can keep up to date on a regular cadence. That's a really good improvement. All right, so yeah, I think we've got a fair amount of things on the agenda, and then Nick also has confirmed that he'll be able to give a little demo for us, walk through the composition functionality. So the rest of the agenda is pretty packed, so let's keep on moving here. Let's move into the vendor updates section. And so this section is for any company or organization doing things around Crossplane to share what they're doing with us. So this is also open for anybody to add what their company is doing with Crossplane. So Jean, do you want to take it away here for what Upbound's doing investments in the near future?
Yeah, I'll keep it very brief. I've kind of like put down the status there. Hassan's getting back to observe only resource design proposal and trying to get through the feedback to get alignment. Eski made great progress on the pluggable secret stores, and we should see some PRs appear in the repos next week, and we're targeting the 1.12 release for that. And we weren't able to make a lot of progress on the validate compositions via webhook. Philippe is working on a proposal for that, but he's been kind of like tied down with some of the CVE work and the renovate dependency updates and so on, and which we felt was necessary to focus on first. So he'll be getting back onto that. So hopefully we'll get a proposal out next week for some feedback as well. That's it.
Fantastic. All right, so let's move down on into the community topics section here. So a couple cool blog posts that folks have been writing recently. I think Dan wrote one. I think it was Dan. If I see package Crossplane, I assume it was probably Dan. wrote a blog post about Crossplane and its package-based approach. That was on the New Stack blog, so you'll be able to check that out. Craig wrote a good blog post about troubleshooting Crossplane. So, a couple different steps and approaches that you can use, to debug and, observability and things like that. And then also Dan, this isn't specifically Crossplane related, but Dan wrote quite an interesting and deeply technical dive into the storage interface for Kubernetes, essentially how things get stored in etcd. So very, very informative if you want to dive into that. So I just thought I'd call that out too. All right. So 1.11, we've been talking about it a lot today, and we've moved to a phase there where we're in code freeze and we're focusing on testing. So Nick has some specific asks around testing that is available in this discussions item right here. And basically, one of the big things here is that there's a lot of new features. So obviously, we'd want people to try those out and make sure that those are working and they're of quality that we'd want to go out with the release. But it's also important here with a fair amount of new features and some of them being hidden behind alpha flags, such as composition functions, that mainline non-alpha functionality does not regress, and that things still work smoothly there for your existing scenarios. So if folks want to dive in to the release candidate builds for 1.11 and try out either new features or make sure that your existing scenarios continue to work and there's no regressions, that would be especially helpful as we're driving to the release on Tuesday. Nick, anything to add to that, my friend?
Not really, just reiterating the rationale is that for the new features, those are mostly alpha. We can fast follow if there are bugs in those. It's a bigger deal if we break existing workflows for people who are not opting into an alpha feature flag. So I know it's a little boring just to test that everything works the same, but you'll probably value catching it now rather than catching it after we've released the 1.11.
Yep. That sounds good then. And so yes, this that issue here talks through what to test or kind of where we want to be focusing our attention on. So you can follow through on that. That's also available in the announcements channel on Slack. All right, so Pete has done an enormous effort on reorganizing the documentation, rewriting some content, adding new articles as well, like an introduction to Crossplane. So this hopefully will be more friendly towards folks at all areas of the spectrum for Crossplane experience. There's an open PR for it here, 271, and a preview for the site. Pete, do you want to share your screen and dive through some things specifically, or do you want me to drive? Or
yeah, I'll share if you.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, let me stop sharing real quick then first. Big red button. There we go. All right, Pete, all yours, I think.
All right. So the biggest thing that I think will catch everybody by surprise is we're now going to have a landing page and we're going to break up some of our content. So if you go to docs.outbound, you'll now be greeted with these 3 columns. So user documentation is kind of most of what used to be documentation. The knowledge base is pulling out a lot of that information into more of a static repository that's not versioned. Guides or integrations, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then a contributing guide specifically for documentation. As we've built this out, kind of got a lot of bells and whistles and processes, and really trying to make it as easy as possible for anybody to contribute documentation to Crossplane. And then of course a shout out right at the top, for the software project, everything's in the contributing MD file. So the knowledge base, a lot of the stuff is still a little bit of a work in progress. And so I think you'll see a bunch of commits after release to keep getting this in shape. But the knowledge base will be independent of releases going forward. Anything that is more generic about Crossplane, that's not about a version, that's not about a Crossplane theory of operation, likely is a good candidate for the knowledge base, right? Anything that's an integration, configuring Crossplane with Argo CD, any special considerations about upgrading or downgrading or whatever that again are not about going from version 1.10 or generic Crossplane. And then the documentation itself, we've got a new little marketing type blurb of what is Crossplane and why do you care. A lengthy introduction to try to introduce each of these concepts to folks. who are new to Crossplane. And I'm in the process of finishing at least the AWS Quick Start. That will be a multi-part process of connecting to AWS, creating managed resources to prove that it connects to AWS, compositions, claims, and claim patching. So really, what are all of those core components of Crossplane, and how do we do it in a quick, simple, and hopefully obvious way? And then we'll repeat that process across across Azure and GCP shortly thereafter. We welcome quick starts for any provider, kind of following that same methodology. So if anybody wants to write a quick start guide for their provider, please let me know. I'll be happy to help. Again, some of this is still being organized, but we have install, uninstall, and upgrade guides that have been rewritten. And then our concepts is merging some of the stuff that was there under the concepts before to try to keep this a little tighter around basically what is every high level concept within Crossplane. So we have a definitive resource on where to look for that. And as always, love feedback. Please let me know in the PR, hit me up directly. And I think another thing with the docs is taking a very kind of continuous delivery approach. So we will push these big changes live with the release on Tuesday. But there's still a lot of work to be done, and we'll just keep making those minor changes as we move forward.
And so, Pete, is there a specific or like a set of pages that you want the most eyes on, or like highest priority to get some visibility on?
Yeah, I think this introduction would be super helpful. That would be one. And then after later this afternoon, the first part of the quick start is written that walks through basically installing Crossplane and connecting and creating a single MR. Part 2 will be completed this afternoon, or will be pushed this afternoon. I just finished it before this meeting. And so that actually walks through creating a composition, creating a CR or an XRD, and all of that stuff. So I think those two would be very helpful.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks for calling that out. And thanks for this big effort to to write and build all the documentation, and especially, but additionally, all the great functionality for note boxes and like copy paste for code blocks and like all that sort of stuff. It's like moving it along pretty far. I like it a lot.
Yeah, I'm going to actually let me show you one other thing that I'm actually pretty excited about.
Sweet.
So this is the draft that hasn't been pushed. This is part 2. So I've done a little bit of work compared to the other one. But one of the things we've done is we've added this ability to highlight when you hover over some of the commands. And especially when we're looking at things like a composite resource definition and how that relates to, say, a claim, this becomes really useful because you can see the XRD kind here maps to the kind in that claim. The spec in that API is there, and custom API maps to the claim name. So hopefully making it a little bit easier. I think this is one of the challenges that I've had as a new person into Crossplane is, everything is so kind of abstract and componentized. It's hard sometimes to see what those lines are that tie them together. And it's been one of my big goals in this new quick start.
Yeah, I love that interactivity and the context there, to be able to see what you're talking about in a paragraph in the code and a paragraph down below. I think that's a fantastic feature.
Thank you.
And then Jason had a comment in the chat around a Upjet provider tutorial section here. I know that there is at least, within the Upjet repo, there is like a guide for adding new resources, but, probably something a little bit more, accessible for new folks and having like a nice doc tech touch to it, seems like a great idea later on too.
Yeah, I would say if you want to do it yourself, of course, I'd love to help you. Otherwise, feel free to open an issue against the docs repo. And I'm working on kind of building a bit of a docs roadmap for the next few months to prioritize some things, and I'll get it in the list. Cool.
Awesome.
Thanks
for this, Pete. All right, I will go ahead and start sharing again. Once I find where Zoom moved the button to. Okay, there we go. Share back to the agenda doc. All right. Agenda doc, I believe, is back. Here we are. So let's keep on moving down the agenda. So we did want to specifically call out the deprecation of controller config in the 1.11 timeframe, and I'll have Dan talk about that a little bit more thoroughly and what that means and where we're going. But I did want to stress that this is simply just an early notification to the ecosystem that this type will be deprecated. It's not being removed in this milestone, and it will not be removed until there's a viable replacement for it, and guidance about how to migrate and all that sort of stuff. So I wanted to make that very clear. And then Dan, if you want to hit some highlights on this deprecation here, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, so controller config was introduced at v0.14, so a long time ago. And at the time, I think the biggest motivator was a feature that a lot of folks use with AWS IAM roles for service accounts. So basically, when we created the deployments, you needed to be able to, set some annotations and things like that on it. When we introduced it, it was a little bit of, this is an alpha feature and it gets the job done, but it is probably not what we want long term. It's kind of continued to expand over time, where it's become almost akin to just a deployment spec, but it's not actually fully compliant. It can be a little bit confusing how to use it. So we've had an issue of open tracking promoting it to beta, which, as you'll see in our feature policy that was already referenced a little bit earlier, we kind of have an up or out policy when it comes to APIs. So this has just been stagnant, so we need to make a decision on it. At the same time, I know this is a feature that a lot of folks have taken a dependency on, despite it being alpha. It was also before our feature flagging mechanism that we have now. So folks have been using this without explicitly setting a flag saying, hey, enable controller configs. And so we want to be extra careful and make sure, that the community has a good transition period here. So as Jared said, this is not a removal. It'll continue to work the exact same way for now, but we are embarking on finding a better solution. So this was just strictly a notification here. If you're interested in what that solution looks like, which it boils down to basically that we want to give folks kind of ultimate flexibility here, but for the happy path, it'll look pretty similar to this. Then you can take a look at the provider runtime interface issue that's linked from there. And if you have any concerns just about this process and how we go through our feature lifecycle, feel free to comment on here. I'm more than happy to chat with anyone about more details about what this means.
Thanks for those details, Dan. All right, so we wanted to make sure that folks are aware of that, and then we'll continue figuring out what is the right replacement to make sure that is a smooth story and solves the use cases that where the community actually has. So Philippe is a new contributor to Crossplane somewhat recently, and he's been working on some pretty useful stuff immediately out of the gates. One of them that I wanted to call out is that we have adopted Renovate to manage all of the project dependencies and stay on top of security advisories and updated Kubernetes versions and all that sort of stuff. I'm not super familiar with Renovate myself yet, so I've been seeing a lot of PRs and a lot of activity and kind of following along, but I'm not an expert with Renovate, but I do like the automation that it provides. So I don't know if it will always keep this issue, if this is a permanent place to look at it, but I do like that it gives you a status of all the dependencies that it wants to update and where it wants to update them. So, you can see that, all the different packages that we have, what it might want to update there. There's not much left at all in master because we've been pushing on that before we cut the release branch for v1.11. But this will, help us stay on top of making sure that, first of all, the most important thing I think is, when there's security vulnerabilities in our dependencies, that we're getting those updated. But then we're also staying up to date, over time with major dependencies such as the Kubernetes clients and packages, et cetera. So, we'll continue using this, and I think Nick and Philippe are pretty on top of all of that so far. Maybe we'll do a little bit of a knowledge sharing on that one, so more people can come a little bit more proficient with it. But it's definitely been helpful to kind of keep the project momentum and moving things forward and staying on top of things. So great work for Philippe to be implementing that and getting that integrated into the project. I also wanted to call out that along with that, somewhat related to that, and our fuzz testing effort and our graduation effort, we have a proposal for the security disclosure process for Crossplane. So we're discussing it on this PR, and if folks want to provide a little bit of feedback on it, that's more than welcome. But essentially this defines the policy through which, if vulnerabilities are discovered within Crossplane, how they can be responsibly disclosed to project maintainers, so we can get a fix in there, and then get that fix published, and security advisories out, etc. So this is super helpful in terms of continuing to mature the project and continuing to improve our security posture, which we're focusing on this year. So this is also another great contribution from Philippe that I wanted to call out too. And I think that's the PR. Yeah, the PR is linked here in the agenda doc. So if folks want to read that and get an idea of where we're going with this, provide some feedback, that's more than welcome. So then the final note I had before we turn it over to Nick for a composition functions demo walkthrough is that there is the opportunity to participate or to apply to participate in the Contrib Fest at KubeCon Europe in Amsterdam this year. We have already applied to do the maintainer track session. We do intro and deep dive. That's already applied to. And then I'm going to today apply to this Contrib Fest opportunity. Hopefully we get it. But the idea is to get people together in a room so we can do some synchronous contributions and effort towards Crossplane. We don't have a specific issue or design that we're working through right now. But the idea is to either identify one that, we'll get in the room, we'll talk through design, we'll, talk through a PR, whatever, do some synchronous work together, which is super exciting to kind of have, the contributor community here actually in a room and hanging out and doing stuff. So I'm super excited about that. If there's not a particular big issue that we're working through or big design that we're working through, then the idea is that we would lead some sort of contributor enablement session. So, folks that are newer to being a contributor on the project, we would do some education, some training, some, presentations, some hands-on stuff, whatever, so that folks that are interested in writing code and contributing to Crossplane can get that education and get that hands-on experience. So either way, it should be fun. I don't know exactly what the agenda is going to be, but either way, it should be a pretty exciting session. So hopefully we get picked for that. I think only 9 projects get picked for it, and I don't know how big the demand is, so we may or may not get selected, but I am pretty excited for the opportunity at least.
Is there anything we can do to help vote? Is there anything we can do to help vote?
I don't think so, Jason. I think it's not like a public thing. It's just, we applied to it, and then, the program selection committee selects on the back end with I don't think it's a transparent process at all, but yeah, I like the idea though. I like the spirit of that, Jason.
So I'll send a private note to Chris.
There you go. That'll move it along. Nice. All right. So Nick, I will go ahead and turn it over to you then, my friend, and you can walk us through some exciting stuff with the composition functions.
Okay, let me just share my screen. All right. Sharing my entire desktop here. And if you see me looking over there, that's because that's where I've put all of you. So I am looking at you despite it looking otherwise. All right, so for anyone who's not aware, composition functions is an alpha feature that we're landing in v1.11 that will allow you to compose resources in Crossplane using tools or languages of your choice. In an existing composition, you will see this array of resources. I'm calling these sort of retroactively naming these patch and transform composition, and then we've added the ability to run functions to teach Crossplane how to compose resources. So when you create a plane or you create an XR, Crossplane needs to know what to do. It needs to know what managed resources or other composite resources to go and make. Historically, you've done that using this array of resources with a bunch of patches and potentially transforms. You could still do that in 1.11. We don't expect that's going to go away. It's definitely not deprecated or anything like that. But now you can, instead of doing that, or in addition to doing that, use what we're calling composition functions. Composition functions work effectively by taking your XR, sending it to a Docker image and saying, hey, Docker image, what do you want me to do with this? And then the Docker image is expected to return back the composed resources that it would like. We think that this is beneficial because it allows you to use more advanced logic without us having to build that into our sort of patch and transform sort of DSL or YAML document. And because you can use general purpose programming languages, there's already great testing tools, already great linking tools, all kinds of stuff for that there. It's also kind of neat because you can just test each function one by one, which is something I'll show later. So getting started, I'll just install a version of Crossplane that has composition function support. What you can see here in my terminal is I just looked for the latest master build of Crossplane, exported that as the release candidate version, 1.11.0 release candidate, something. And these arguments I'm going to give to Helm, I'm going to install an upbound system just because I'm going to use an upbound sort of configuration to test this out. It's easier to use that namespace. I'm going to turn on debug logging for the core Crossplane pod. I'm going to turn on a feature flag to enable composition functions. This feature flag has to be on or composition functions will not work. That's because it's alpha and we reserve the right to just delete it or change the API fundamentally, so not recommended for production use. I'm also going to set xfunction.enabled true. Xfunction is a sidecar container that runs next to Crossplane, and it's the container that Crossplane uses to actually run composition functions. Just see if we got some Crossplane pods. We did. And if we describe this Crossplane pod, you'll see that in addition to the normal Crossplane container, we have this Crossplane xfunction container, xfn container next to it. So we've designed composition functions for the runner that actually runs the OCI images to be pluggable in Crossplane, which means that there could be different implementations of them. We did this because we couldn't think of sort of one perfect way to run functions that would work well for everyone. There was just a lot of trade-offs in every direction. So the reference implementation is going to run as a sidecar. It's going to use what we call rootless containers to run containers. Kind of neat. It runs containers inside itself. These containers that are run for composition functions are typically a shell script or a really simple Python script, like I'll show today, something really small. All right, so let me cut over to this xfunctions directory here. In this directory, I've created a composition function. If you happen to know Python, you might get a sense of what this does. I was joking the other day that I was a full-time professional Python distributed systems developer for 8 years. And then I didn't do it for 5 years, and now I write really bad Python code. The general idea here, though, is what we're going to do is pass each function. Crossplane basically is going to pass each function a document called a function IO. When you give Crossplane this array of functions here, it's going to take a function, it's going to build a function IO. And that function IO at first is going to have the XR, and it's going to have any composed resources that come out of the patch and transform process, which could be 0 if you're not using patch and transform. And it's going to pass those to the first container in the function pipeline. And then that container is going to pass it to the next container in the function pipeline. The way it passes things to these containers is on standard in. So the process's standard input as a file effectively, and it encodes it using this sort of custom resource looking document. This is not a Kubernetes custom resource. You don't create a function IO in your API cluster. It just looks like a Kubernetes custom resource. This is passed to standard in to your function. And in this case, it's saying, hey, first function in the pipeline, there are no composed resources. The only thing that I have observed is a composite resource, and the composite resource looks like this. And then it's going to expect the function to give back some desired resources. It's going to expect the function to set an object called desired and include an array of composed resources there, as well as a desired resource. Telling myself that Jean is not laughing at me while he giggles away there.
He's been giggling for a while now,
As I
so
do
it must be
my,
something else.
presentation.
I apologize, Nick. Like your composition functions is really entertaining, but not as entertaining as something else at the moment. I'll turn off my video.
All right, so let's build this function. So this is just at the moment on the alpha launch, there's not going to be any sort of tooling to help you build functions outside of what you just get in the Docker ecosystem. But the nice thing is that they are just a Docker image effectively. So I can just do Docker build. I'll show you really quick my Docker file. It basically is just using a build container to make a virtual environment for Python to build this up. And then it is putting that into the distro list container, which has a Python executable in it. I should also clarify what we expect this function to do. Let's look at this again. Oops. This function hits an API called Quotable, which is just an API endpoint that I found someone put on GitHub that gives you a random quote. And all that this function does is complete toy just for demos. It'll take any existing composed resources and annotate them with a quote. So not something that's very useful in real life, but something that's pretty quick to demo. Hassan has a much more interesting composition function that he started working on that'll actually use Go templates to render out composed resources. So this is kind of part of the spirit of composition functions. We know that different people have different preferences. Some people love YAML, some people hate YAML, some people love HCL, some people love Helm, some people hate Helm. By sort of giving you an open-ended way to do composition, you can sort of pick and choose the tool and the practices that fits for you. So in this case, let's pretend I work in Python every day. So Python is what I'm most comfortable with. And that's how I would like to provide my composition logic. That's kind of what I'm doing here. Oops, let's tag this thing that I just built. I already have, and let's push my simple quotable thing. It's already going to be in the Docker repository. All right, so now I'm going to cut over to this platform ref GCP directory. I haven't actually prepared an actual configuration for Crossplane, so but I do have this one sort of checked out. So I'm going to just already forgotten what my Docker image was called. Where are you? Oh, it's over in this other window. Nope, this one. There we go. Grab this. So this is a platform ref composition. It's something that Upbound puts together. It just demonstrates using Crossplane with GCP. I'm going to take it basically as it is, and I'm just going to modify it to run the one composition function that we just built. So in addition to all of the patch and transform stuff that's already going on here, it's going to run our simple quotable composition function, and I would expect that means that everything that comes out the other end of this composition will have a quote on it.
Nick, you said that the functions are run in order, but after any patch and transform stuff is applied.
Yes, okay. Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah, and looking behind the scenes, what actually happens when you enable this feature flag is Crossplane will completely change its composition engine to use one that is aware of both patch and transform and composition functions, because they kind of need to be interwoven together. If you use both, the rough flow is Crossplane will grab any existing composed resources. Then if there is patch and transform configured, it will use those to render both new and update existing composed resources. Then before it creates or applies any of those changes, it will pass them to the composition function pipeline and say, hey, composition function pipeline, what do you want to do with these, if anything? And then finally, once all that's run, it'll be like, okay, I built up all my state. Now I'm going to go apply that to the cluster. So that means that, if you don't have functions, just leave the functions out and it'll go straight from patch and transform to apply. If you don't want to use patch and transform, just skip that. It'll go straight to the functions, and the functions will have to produce all the resources that they want. Okay, I think I have done everything I need. I am going to need to install a provider though.
And Nick, Carlos has a couple questions in the chat that you can either, address like now if it's a good time in the flow, or at the end, if that's better for your flow.
I would prefer to do it at the end, if that's all right. First, I just need to, because I'm not. Aha, there we go. Because I am not using a configuration, I need to just manually install my providers, and I'm struggling to find the command to do that. Actually, I have a nope. Okay. Just waiting for provider GCP to install. Oh, go away. Okay, quite good. Just a little script that brute forces a bunch of provider configs for all the testing that I do. What it's effectively going to do is create a provider config for GCP with an account that we use regularly for Crossplane testing.
And quick time check, Nick. We have it's like 3 or 4 minutes left in the hour.
Yep, understood. I'm hopefully pretty close. There's just unfortunately a bunch of stuff I have to apply manually because I didn't create a configuration of this. I feel like there's probably a flag to just apply this whole directory, but I don't remember what it is. So all right, now I believe everything that we need has been done. I'm finally going to actually make a cluster claim. All right. I have a bunch of composite resources. The XG key one was the one that I applied my composition function on. You can see that that has just selected a composition, which is pretty normal. Have a look at what Crossplane is saying at the moment. And let's have a look at the Crossplane X function pod. And you can basically say there's not a lot of debugging going on in X function pod at the moment, but it's basically telling you it is running some functions. Interestingly, I see it's running 2 functions, which is not what is expected there. So who knows what's actually going on? I must have messed something up. All right, so we have composed some resources now. And let's have a look at one of those.
The function was applied at the composition level, Nick. Is that right? So then all of the composed resources there would we expect to have this annotation?
Yes, but that is not fundamental to composition function.
Oh, right.
So you always put your function in a composition, And the function can then apply to the XR that uses that composition, and therefore the claim, or all the composed resources. It's not what's the word? It's kind of, it's not like it only applies to composed resources.
Right. Okay. Good clarification.
All right, and there you go. Woohoo, demo complete. You can see that that composition function has run. It has gone and hit quotable.io, and it has updated the annotations on all of the composed resources to have this quote. Obviously, this is a little bit of a toy, right? But not something you would really want to do. But these composition functions could instead be actually creating and describing these entire composed resources. You could use them to enforce policy if you wanted to as well. All kind of stuff there. All right, let me see if I can really quickly look at the new messages from Carlos.
And I can help you out with that, Nick. Carlos is asking, why not a webhook, i.e. HTTP JSON as an interface for input and output instead of using standard in, standard out?
The main reason I would that I like this interface rather than the webhook is because this interface, you build an OCI container, right? You've got a small amount of logic usually that you want to run, and you run that as a Docker image. If you instead want to hit a webhook, you have to go and deploy that webhook somewhere. Typically, I know that there's Lambda and there's some options for this, but typically I think going and deploying and maintaining and running and building a web server that has your logic in it is more work than building a Docker image. Does that make sense?
So can you hear me?
Yep.
So the container that the function is specifying, you don't run it, you mount it and you execute the file, or?
We run it, but if it was a webhook, then I would imagine that someone else would have to run it, right? And I think that's kind of the benefit of the approach that we take here.
Okay, maybe I don't know how the runtime that you're using to run a container works. Okay.
Well, we
run a container and then it runs a file, an executable. That executable might run a web server or might not run a web server.
The functions shouldn't. I guess I'm a little lost. Sorry. If you just go back to the fundamentals of what we want to do, we have some code that we want to run, right?
Yep.
And Crossplane wants to say run this code. When I hear webhook, what I hear is the code is hosted by some external service, right? Crossplane.
Oh no, I was referring to you run that container and that container runs a daemon on port 8080, and then you just send the data in and then you get the data out.
So would that mean that when we run a function, the function would have to be like a long-lived process that's always running and always listening?
Yep. Or you can shut it down after you get your message back, and you're in control of that container.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It seems like much of a muchness to me. I guess the trade-off is then you have to have web server ability, and you've got to listen on a port, and you've got to make sure that that port is locked down and all that kind of stuff. I don't think it's fundamentally a worse approach than what we're doing, but I don't think it's a fundamentally better approach either, off the top of my head, but maybe I'm missing something.
Okay, yeah, I can discuss more on Slack. It's just my background is yeah, I've done this before with other interfaces, where for some people telling them, hey, run a container that listens on port 8080 is like bread and butter to them, versus write a container that has something inside that takes standard in this format, standard out in this other format. By their fourth sentence, you lost that person, versus the other person just, you follow? For the world.
I don't think I agree, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Like
I don't want you to agree. It's just understand the trade-off. Yeah, understand. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Carlos. And then so Jesse had a question as well. Jesse has his hand up, but
I'll go really quickly. Oh, good.
Yeah, just make a quick announcement that the regular time for the meeting is over. So any folks that want to drop off and get to other things, do feel free to. But otherwise though, yeah, Jesse, happy to hear from you too.
Yeah, so it's a comment and a question, an open-ended question. The comment is we've been, investigating how to allow for folks to use compositions and develop them kind of in a fashion that's, distributed amongst multiple teams, multiple time zones, and not necessarily through a kind of single funnel. And one of the issues that we've had is how do we test effectively across all of those new compositions that are coming in, and give the teams the ability to do that testing in isolation of each other. And I think one of the questions I have about compositions generally, and the use of composition functions, but just generally about compositions, is how do you test that YAML, right? How do you test it amongst the integration between compositions and compositions of compositions and so on and so forth. And I think what I like seeing with custom compositions is now, and I think you mentioned it a little bit, Nick, now you have the atomicity to kind of test them individually. You can test at the function level, and the inputs and outputs there become kind of, something that you can, prove consistency through automated testing.
Yeah, I'll just cut over here and share again real quick, but it should be possible to like test this out by, oops, that was not the one that I wanted, but there we go. Yeah, so you can just use, I just ran that function locally and sent it some test data that was a function IO that I prepared earlier that's on the local file system, and I can validate that logic works the way I want without having to like even be running Crossplane or anything like that.
Right, exactly. Thank you.
No worries.
I have a question around the just the function runners. So you don't have to use the default function runner, right? You could just have like a gRPC endpoint somewhere, and behind there you can just do whatever you want, pretty much.
Yep.
Okay, so for that you just pass the xfn blah blah blah. What is it called? xfn dot enabled for that. Just set that to false, and then it will enable the composition functions, but it's not going to run the default function.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there is a option when you I didn't sort of show the full spec of when you're saying you'd like to run a function. When in the composition, when you're running a function, you can specify quite a lot of things, like whether it has network access or not, what compute resources it should be limited to or not. And one of the things you can specify is basically what is the endpoint of the runner that should run this function for me. The default is to use an abstract Unix domain socket, which is how we sort of communicate without sort of going over the network as such to our sidecar pod. In the code that's there at the moment in alpha, we don't use encryption or authentication or anything like that on the gRPC stuff. So you probably don't want to go run like, go send gRPC to something over the actual network over TCP or HTTP2, but the intention is to support that at some point in the future. I also like we initially this TBD, but under the design, I thought running this as a sidecar would be a great way to do it. But it just sort of occurred to me that the function runner we have at the moment is stateless, and there's sort of no reason we couldn't deploy a whole lot more of them. But you could also imagine an implementation that went and just like sent things to the kubelet or something like that as well. In the initial design, we explored, again, there's a ton of trade-offs here. Like if you go talk to the kubelet, it becomes kind of a pain to like pass a standard input, get standard output, all that kind of stuff. There's potentially like, we really want these functions to spin up instantaneously. And if you're like running a Kubernetes cluster, there's a potential that it'll be like, hey, just wait 5 minutes while I bring a node online, which is not something you want to block your composition with. So.
Okay.
But long story short, yes, you can just turn off the X function runner and point it at something else. You might need to send some code to make doing so secure.
Right. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, I love all the feedback here. And
excuse me, and it's going to be even better too once we get this out with 1.11 and people get their hands on it and try it out and start writing their own functions, and there's reusable functions that people can use to make their compositions go more smoothly without having to write code too. So just a whole bunch of stuff this opens up, and super excited about it. So Nick, thanks for driving it and thanks for showing it off today as well. This is kind of a bit of a game changer, I think, for what Crossplane can do. So super pumped for this. But we're over time now, and I think other folks got some responsibilities to get to here. So let's go ahead and wrap it up for the day then. Great to see everybody. By the time we meet next time, we will have the Vue 1.11 released out. So thanks everybody for contributions to that. And if you can test it, that would be great as well. And great to see everybody today. Bye, everybody.